Today I'm going to break down all the steps for this easy watercolor painting landscape. If you want to learn how to draw a beautiful desert and sand with watercolors, you don't need a lot of colors nor time to do it. This painting, like I said, does not require to use plenty of colors, and the sketching part is minimal, so if you're a complete beginner, this is going to be perfect to get you started. First of all, you want to get a piece of watercolor paper. Mine is a 5x7 piece I cut out of a large sheet. It's 100% cotton paper, cold pressed, and I'll link the exact reference of this and all the supplies I used here in the description. I recommend this type of paper, whatever the brand, although it's more expensive than wood pulp paper. It will give you better results and encourage you to keep experimenting with watercolors. Now I'm using some masking tape to keep my sheet from moving as I paint and to get crisp edges. The sketch is very simple here. We just want to draw the sand dunes. I'll link the reference photo I used in the description. I suggest you don't press too hard with your pencil, otherwise gently erase the lines so they're still visible but not so harsh. I'm using the confetti set by Art Philosophy today. I like it because it has enough colors I can paint whatever I want. Today I'm only using one shade of blue in this painting, and yellow and brown. That's just 3 colors. I'm using various paintbrushes here because I have some choice. For instance, I have a flat brush I used to apply water in large areas, then a large round natural hair fiber brush I used to do backgrounds, and finally my smaller and more precise paintbrushes. All you need is a large enough round paintbrush to paint the sky easily and the sand dunes, and a more detailed paintbrush for the shadows. That's really it. I decided today to go for the wet on dry technique for my sky, which means I'm not wetting the paper first, I just drop the paint. I usually use the wet and wet technique for skies, but here the sky is just plain blue, so I figured wet on dry would be adequate since it's just one color. What I like about it too is that since there's less water in the process, the paint dries more vibrant than if I was painting on wet paper. I also managed to get a cleaner transition with my sand dunes. When the paper is wet, sometimes the paint that is meant for the sky will get on another part of the painting. Using the wet on dry technique like I'm doing right now prevents this from happening. There's water only in the brush, so the paint is way easier to control. Now you have to watch for one thing with this technique. It's the fact that the paint dries faster. Again, because there's less water since the paper is dry. The problem with that is that when you're painting a sky like this one, it's a large area, so you need to be fast every time you go load your brush with paint again. Don't let what you applied on the paper dry, otherwise there will be a harsh edge. A good way to help with the paint drying less fast is to dilute it with enough water so that the mix you're applying on paper is not too thick. The thicker it is, the faster it will dry. In watercolor, managing a painting always goes back mainly to knowing how to control water. I'm going to link helpful videos I made about this up here and in the description, and I recommend you to watch them because they will help you understand how to avoid frustrating marks, stains, blooms, and the paint bleeding everywhere. If you're having trouble with this, you can very well use the wet and wet technique. There is not just one way of painting. Actually, I had that problem here of making some kind of streaks that are noticeable now my paint is dry. So I decided to add another coat and even another one because I'm a perfectionist and always testing things, but really one single layer of blue is more than enough here. If you do want to layer another coat of paint like I did, it's better to wait for the sky to dry completely first. I like to use a heat gun, but you can use a hairdryer if you want to speed up the process. Now we're moving on to the sand dunes. Remember I picked yellow and brown earlier. Well, actually my idea was to mix the two to get some kind of a golden color that's not as flashy as yellow and not as dull as brown. I'm finding it perfect for sand. My mix looks like a golden yellow. Again here I'm working wet on dry. And again I mixed enough water to my paint that it is not only easy to apply, but it's not too thick that it's going to dry extremely fast. You should have time to load your brush and keep painting without getting harsh lines everywhere you stop. While the surface is still wet, I'm adding some of my plain brown shade in those areas I noticed are darker in the photo. It's important to do it because that's what's going to make your painting look like it's real. You always should think about painting your shadows and highlights in your paintings. I do this in all of my paintings. And I'm a huge fan of contrast and realism. So if you want to learn more, I'm going to link here another video where I show exactly how I paint from reference, how I get the shadows and the highlights. Here, I was trying to lift some paint to start defining the little path we see on the reference photo, but in the end, I decided it would be better to use a darker shade of my brown. I'm letting this dry completely, and I'm making more of those golden yellow and brown mixes because now I want to accent the shadows some more. I apply my paint where the shadows are located with a paintbrush I love to use for details, wet on dry still. Before the paint even dries, I fade the edges of it with a clean and damp brush. This helps making subtle shadows because they just melt into the rest of the painting. While the area the shadow is in is still wet, you can even add more brown to intensify it a little bit. I keep doing this on all my sand dunes, and I'm careful not to cover areas that are contiguous, because if the wet paint touches another wet area, they will bleed into each other and the shadows will look less defined and the painting a bit messy. On this bigger dune, the sand and shadow there look like they've been carved by the wind, so I'm trying to render that with my paintbrush by making those curvy strokes. Movement is important when you paint with watercolors. It's all done with your brush strokes. I'll add a sky painting video up here and in the description if you want to learn more about that. That's optional, but here I decided to re-wet everything after it dried and add a bit more brown where some of the shadows are located because I felt it would make an even better contrast. See what works for you. If you're satisfied with how your painting looks, you won't even need to do this, but if you want to work on it a little more, layers are always helpful. Now I'm making those lines with my fine tip brush and some of that brown mix I made earlier. I'm doing it when the paper is dry and with the tip of my brush. If I was to do it on a wet surface, it would become blurry and less subtle. We also want to make sure to use the tip of the brush and not press too hard to keep those lines really thin. I want to add some interest to my painting, so since the foreground is always supposed to be darker in a painting since it's closer and has more detail, I'm going to splatter a little bit of that brown mix on the sand to add texture. You can see how this looks much better all of a sudden. If when you flick your brush at the paper, no paint comes out, add some water to your brown mix. If the paint is too thick, it's difficult to splatter. If it's very watery, you may get huge drops. All you need is to test it on a separate piece of paper and you will get those splatters right. They're easy and really fun for beginners and advanced artists alike. I hope you enjoyed this painting as much as I did. If so, please help my channel out by liking, commenting, or sharing this video on social media. And if you're not yet, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of my future videos. Thanks for watching and see you in the next ones.